In this episode, we react to claims that there is a double standard in play in the way that Kamala Harris is treated by voters and the media relative to Donald Trump. And later on after that, we'll consider what the decline in sex in movies says about our culture. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and join me today is a man who may not be known as a chef, but is always cooking up some good takes. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show off your verbal intercourse skills today?
Of course. Only built for Cuban links, for those who know who the real chef of the hip hop.
The real chef, yeah.
So yeah,
you don't claim to be him.
No, I'm not him, but I'm dating myself when I talk about him, knowing who he was. Because
hey, so am I with the failed reference.
Now a generation of the past, yeah.
Yeah. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you subscribe and hit like on YouTube or your podcast platform. Doing so really helps the show out. Now, recording on October 29th, 2024, and we have a big election coming up here in the U.S., and at this point, we've reached, kind of the stage where most people's views on things are pretty set. But in looking at these views, some observers have recently started to call attention to what they call as a double standard in the way that the presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, are judged. And Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas said recently, we've got one candidate who's allowed to be lawless while the other has to be flawless, which was, a cute way to put it together. But she's not alone in this sentiment. We've seen people like Michelle Obama talk about this, Van Jones, and even Eugene Robinson over at the Washington Post wrote a big thing on it. And, really laying out the case. And so just to jump right in, Tunde, what do you make of the claim from many that Harris is, that there's a double standard, between how she's treated, Kamala Harris is treated by the public and the media relative to how Donald Trump is treated by these same people?
I mean, I would say it's a great question because I would say from my perspective in the media that I consume, I think that's an accurate statement. And I know that today's discussion will be us laying that case out and giving our examples and so on and so forth. But as you wind up the question, it makes me realize that, yeah, for those of us, I would say, who, have the desire or the benefit of viewing different sources of information, we can make a better comparison of this. And I do think that there are some people out there that would hear this conversation, and because of the information ecosystems they're in, they would just basically call us people that are projecting and that there's a double standard, but it's not in Kamala Harris's to her detriment. It's all on Donald Trump, so on and so forth. So I think even this discussion can't escape the kind of the divisions that have been sown in this kind of discourse about even how two candidates are being covered. But to answer directly, yes, I do see a double standard. And I know that's what we're here to talk about.
Well, the quote, he's allowed to be lawless while she has to be flawless, I think pulls out because, I think that pointing to partisans, people who are just so in the bag for someone, and even with the quote that I gave, that's from a Democratic representative of Congress. That's not even necessarily where this is most interesting to me. Like, I'm looking at the people that are supposedly trying to be fair. Like, I would say the mainstream media, so to speak, which, many Trump supporters will say that that's in the bag for the Democrats, so to speak. I would say that's incorrect. But the people are pointing to the mainstream media as saying that they have a double standard as they apply it to Trump. People are pointing to kind of voters who at least claim to be less partisan, that are looking at the candidates and applying different standards. I think this is real, but I actually think this has less to do with Kamala Harris. I think that since 2015, we've seen that the people who either are supporting of Trump, and it probably comes from them, but then it filters out to the public at large. I just don't think that Donald Trump is held to any standard whatsoever. And we've seen this, whether it would be, the Access Hollywood tape, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, this is going to be the end. If he was held to the standards of a normal politician, he would have been out then. Or, all the way up to you follow that all the way through, and all the things that he says, rapists and murderers about, whole types of people. And All of these things that, by the standards we normally hold politicians to, would have been wipeout material, have been things that just brush right off of them. So yes, there's a double standard, but the double standard is a result of the fact that Trump has been held to no standard by his own supporters. And what's ended up happening is that the media then takes a cue from that and says, all right, well, if we talk about all the bad things, if we talk about Trump's crimes, if we talk about the fact that he tries to overthrow the government or things like that at January 6th and incites an insurrection, things that there are no comparable thing to say, oh, well, Kamala Harris did this. I know Donald Trump incited an insurrection, or I know he wouldn't accept a free and fair election, but Kamala Harris did this. There's no two sides of that. It's just one person doing wild things. But those things don't seem to move the needle for people. The people who see Donald Trump as a threat already know all that stuff. And the people who are who don't see that are kind of unfazed by that because they don't look to him as having to be held to any standard. And I've been taken aback, and you saw, I brought this to you several times in the past week or so. I'm blown away by the on the record quotes that we've seen from General Milley, from John Kelly, who was the chief of staff with Donald Trump during his first term. This stuff is stuff I've never seen, even read about before, in terms of the staff or the people who worked for the president, our president from 2017 to 2021, Donald Trump, saying that this guy has contempt for the Constitution. This guy wants to rule like a dictator, that this guy is a fascist. These aren't Democrats saying this stuff. These are people who are either military generals or part of Donald Trump's staff that are saying that this guy is bad news and that this doesn't faze either the center of the country or anybody even in the right center or anything like that. Obviously, the pure partisans in the tank aren't going to be fazed by this because they've long ago decided that nothing he does will affect the way they view it. But part of this is, and this is where I wanted to land this, is that a lot of times other people can't hold you to standards. What really comes down to, once you're an adult, it comes down to the standards you hold yourself to. And so what we're seeing here really is that the Republican Party apparently this is filtered into the mainstream media and many voters have decided that the Republicans don't need to hold themselves and the Republicans have decided not to hold themselves to a standard when it reflects to their presidential candidate at minimum. And the other parts of the country have just come along with that, say, all right, well, these guys don't care about whether this guy does anything unethical, illegal, unbecoming, hostile to the Constitution, which I thought was the whole thing we were doing here. But nonetheless, it showed the standards you hold yourself to is the one that I think is really revealed. And there is Kamala Harris's side, so to speak, still is trying to hold themselves to a higher standard. And I just don't think that the people lining up behind Donald Trump are interested in holding themselves to a high standard anymore.
Yeah, well, I think there's several cross currents here. One is, I think, authoritarianism and the type of people that fall in line into that type of way of being or system or however we can call it. So clearly, you're right. There's some people that just they either they don't care about the double standard when it's on their side, or they just do some sort of mental gymnastics to give themselves the emotional out that they don't need to. And I think that's where the other side,
something. Well, that's where it comes from, where it's saying, oh, well, it's a double standard that on the other side, actually, without pointing to specific instances, but just
I think there's a couple things. I think there's some projection with some of that, but I think there's some of it which is just look, I've had people in my personal life in the last few weeks really tell me that they genuinely believe that Kamala Harris will give transgender surgery to illegal immigrants and whatever, right, and people in prison. And that's why, again, I'm glad she pointed out in her in her Fox News interview that was a policy started in 2018 under the Trump administration. So again, it's a double standard. So something that started under the Trump administration, everyone was quiet about until 2024 and the election. And now all of a sudden it's, and it goes back to, as much as I'm not a fan of Hillary Clinton, to be fair, it was the same with her email server. Remember, we learned that Colin Powell and Dick Cheney and all these other people were using their private servers.
The same thing, yeah.
And then we learned after the transition of the administrations that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner were using their private Gmail accounts to do government business when they were White House advisors. I'm getting taxpayer salaries. So
Yeah.
again, it is some sort of double standard in that way. And I don't know. That's what I mean. I'm sure there's multiple motivations from it that we can't get in everybody's head. But I do think that it's something that's undeniable, and I think that it's something that when you kind of look at it, it's just like, okay, so what is the motivating factor here? And I think that's where the divisions just get deeper and deeper, because then you either always have to say, well, the other side is so bad, and begin to believe lies that are being told by Donald Trump, like that you'll send your 10-year-old kid to their fourth grade class, at 8 in the morning today, and by 3 p.m. your boy is coming home with a vagina. You
Mhm.
like, like the worst lie that just is so unbelievable it doesn't even, make sense. And then but someone will say, this is why I need to avoid Donald Trump and what he just said or how he behaved or whatever, because I want to believe that, even though there's no proof of
Well,
what
no, I
anybody
think
just
that
said. Just like
tying
the
it to like
Haitians eating
the
pets.
yeah, just tying it to the
Yeah.
outlandish conspiracy theories, I think, is a good connection, because that does, because again, it is this ends justify the means thinking, like in many respects. Like, again, it's ends justify the means when people still have some conflict about supporting a man who is a convicted felon, who is unethical by every measure, and everything like that, who tried to overthrow the Constitution, like documented, and has talked about now, like ruling as a
Yeah.
dictator or something. But again, so there's some of that. If you still face some type of dissonance with that, then yeah, the conspiracy theories give you a place to go
Yeah.
to then resolve that and say, okay, well, these other issues, because of these other issues. But again, that stuff still is avoiding it, so to speak. I'm still trying to avoid it. The person who, and I want to get to this to a different point, because I don't want to sit here and stay in the same part. The other piece about this, though, would not be the partisans. Like, it's beyond the partisans. And so we spent some time on the partisan part, but I've seen, for example, what I would consider a double standard, where we're talking about Palestinian Americans or Muslim Americans who look at Harris and are like, I just can't support Harris because of what's happening in Gaza. And so that is basically the connection that I see there, is that, okay, well, because Netanyahu, who is the leader of Israel, is doing certain things in Gaza, and Biden hasn't stopped him, I guess, Commander in Chief Biden, which Kamala Harris as a vice president wouldn't be able to do anything directly about that anyway, but Biden hasn't stopped him, another sovereign nation, or Biden has continued along his support of Israel along the same path, then therefore that makes Kamala Harris hostile to the people in Gaza or something like that. That logic, though, doesn't follow by saying I can't support Harris, they either will support Donald Trump, who's the man who moved the embassy to Jerusalem, who has done overt acts that are hostile to Muslim Americans, saying, hey, we're going to ban all Muslims, things like that. And so I don't see how that's not someone who, at least on the surface, is coming from a partisan lens. They're saying, I'm hurt by what's happening here, so therefore I'm going to take it out on this person. But all of the other things that may have happened, I'm just not going to apply that same thing to this other person. Like in a winner take all election, if you withhold your support from one person, you are de facto supporting another person. So to me, that part is interesting, because I'm trying to follow the mental gymnastics that's followed there. Again, by somebody, I'm not taking them as overly partisan. Now, maybe it is. Maybe there's other stuff going on. We haven't mentioned yet the idea of sexism, which and kind of like like the toxic masculinity thing. Like, oh, well, I'm uncomfortable voting for a woman, so I'm going to find things that I can say out loud. I don't want to say that I'm uncomfortable voting for a woman, so I'm going to find things that I can say out loud that will justify me not supporting her, because I just don't want to support her because she's a woman. There's that. There's potentially race issues, things like that. And I don't want to minimize those, but those are the things that, unless people are coming out and saying it, it's hard to detect, so to speak.
Yeah.
You can look at incongruity in people's arguments, but that still doesn't necessarily mean it's one of those. So, I mean, beyond the partisans, beyond like looking at even the media, the mainstream media, again, which you and I look at as corporate, but some people look at it as left wing, which is just bizarre. As those for-profit entities, those capitalist entities. But like, they'll even, again, they don't, when Trump says gaffes, when Trump does different things, it gets less scrutiny than if Kamala Harris has detailed her policies enough. Again, against Trump, who just says, hey, I'll solve all the problems without much detail. So what do you think about, again, taking it out the partisan lens?
Yeah, there's a couple things. So I want to break it up two different parts of where I'm going to go from here, and I want you to jump on both, but separately. One is the idea of projection, The other is just a conversation about journalism or lack thereof. So with projection, just quickly, and I'm just going to back it up a bit. And it amazes me what like you're saying, the double standard, where because we see this unprecedented step down of a president during the election cycle in the campaign a few months before, and the vice president takes over, we see a shift in the strategy of attack from the Trump side. So, for example, when Trump was going through all his legal problems post January 6th and the stealing of the documents and the stuff with the New York case or, the felony stuff, what was the other side trying to do?
Yeah. When those cases were hot and active.
Yeah, like when he was going through his legal stuff, the other side we did discussions about this. The whole Congress, the Republican Congress, all this, used all this time and resources instead of governing and doing their job of helping American people. They were doing all these witch hunts against the Biden crime family, right? And all this, they had all this stuff.
And that was the phrase that we would hear all the time.
So it was trying to say for their viewers and their base and their fans of Trump, hey, don't worry about whatever our guy's doing here. Whatever they're saying is a lie, because look at how much of a crime family this is. Now, that case, that whole conversation totally collapsed because, number one, there was no evidence. Number two, the only evidence that was being provided, it was found out, was from a Russian spy. So again, that's a whole different conversation.
They once the cases weren't that active anymore, they didn't need that deflection anymore. So it kind of
and that's my point.
It served its purpose.
Yeah, and so now with Kamala Harris, it's they don't have the background, they didn't have the time, that I'm sure dudes like this whole opposition marketing. So it's not that she's a criminal. What is it? Because Donald Trump is incoherent, rambles when he talks. He does the famous weave. He starts changing subjects. He's like a squirrel. He can't even answer a question without going into 3 different topics. Now the projection is that she's dumb as rocks, that does a word salad, all this stuff. So I find a lot of the double standard is actually a calculated attack. It's that whole thing of attack your opponent's strength, or whatever your weakness is,
put onto them.
Put onto the opponent, so everyone's looking over there. So that's one thing I think is going on. And the second
or at minimum, it cancels out. Well, let's stay there for a second.
Okay, because then I want to go to.
So you're saying that. So in that sense, the point would be that it's the non-part where we see this in non-overtly partisan spaces is a result of the success of a marketing campaign, which is interesting. These messages have been driven home by partisans good enough, basically, that it kind of gets adopted in kind of the mindsets of people, whether they realize it or not, that they've adopted these partisan memes in their mind, even though they themselves haven't become overtly partisan, or at least.
And let me jump in here, and I want to let you go, but because I wanted to.
I'm trying to make sure I'm summarizing your point correctly.
Yeah, no, but think about the book, because as you're talking, it makes me realize in the book *Sapiens*, what was one of the most important glues for a human community? Myths and gossip.
Yeah, shared.
And so that provided. Right, for partisan people, a myth of the messianic figure in Donald Trump being attacked wrongly, and it kind of goes on that. That's why the religious people are very attracted to it, because it's a messianic message. And then the gossip, right? If you think about it, you're on Fox News every day, you're on social media with your friends, you're gossiping about the Biden crime family and how it's so unfair what they're doing to Trump and these investigations and all that, and it satisfies something in a lot of people. And so, and I'm not saying that actually as a right or wrong thing. I'm just saying that's just, like you said, it's a smart marketing campaign for people who otherwise aren't going to win elections through popular vote, through showing their strength in governing or growing.
I still think you're gravitating more to the partisans here, though, because I'm really trying to look at the people who aren't overtly partisan. But I think the point holds up. Because
let me jump to journalism.
When this is in the ether, let me respond though. When it's out there enough, and we've learned this from the different, the fire hose of falsehood, for example, when you get certain messages out there enough, and then you can target them into, and this is a term that's used a lot nowadays when we're talking about quote unquote low information voters, so to speak, then if you can get to them first and get to them often, then you actually can shape their perceptions of candidates, And so if it's people who aren't following the news and saying, oh, okay, well, this is a substantiated allegations. Oh, this is kind of just made up. And every time they try to bring this up, they fail to produce any evidence. You can't really tell the difference between that. So I think it's a good point. I mean, and I hadn't looked at it like that. Just the idea that the work being done by the partisans is able to influence the people who maybe pay less attention, who aren't partisan, and pay less attention because that's what they keep seeing. Is they like, oh, well, if I keep seeing people saying that she's dumb, then I guess she's probably dumb, so to speak. Even though I don't really listen to one guy. If you listen to both of them talk, you wouldn't even, one of them was a former attorney general and the other was born into wealth. That's not something you would necessarily, that would stand up to any kind of scrutiny. But nonetheless, it's one of those things. So, all right, to your media point.
No, but you give a good segue there to journalism, right? Because that speak number one, and I want to, we could bifurcate this into different silos. Like one is, it's not all the mainstream media's fault and all that, because we just have this plethora of new technology that offers all these new platforms. Like, I mean, think about it. Trump just did the interview with Joe Rogan.
Let's stay focused though. Because like just looking at it, what was
I'm going to get to it. Because I was just going to mention that it is a new thing. Like the Joe Rogan interview with Trump had 30 million viewers. I mean, that's just not something that was happening 20, 30 years ago because we had the
But when we're talking about a double
TV.
Standard, though, I don't think we're talking about Joe Rogan.
Well, what I'm saying is the double standard of
like people
journalism.
Who hold themselves up as but Joe Rogan's not a journalist. He doesn't hold himself up as
I know. That's my point. But a lot of people, he's got 30 million people that will trust him like journalists were trusted in the past. And I think that is because what I'm getting at is it doesn't allow people to see when Trump goes on Joe Rogan, and this is why Trump avoided a second debate, why he avoided 60 Minutes, because journalists would ask him about to explain how he came up with the fact that you're going to send your boy to school, elementary school, and they're going to come home a girl. They would ask him to really articulate more his tariff policy, which when he's been asked, he can't articulate it. They would ask him more and more about why he keeps calling Americans internally enemies that are going to be chased down by the military that he'll stick on them. And they would ask him about 2020 and insurrection, 21 and all that. So I think that is also what's happening is that Trump, for whatever reason, is being given a pass where he can hide from the mainstream media. But when Kamala Harris wasn't doing interviews, what was it? It was complaining about, oh, she's not doing interviews. Oh, she's not discussing her policies. And that's the thing. She discusses her policies. Just people don't want to highlight them. But then this guy discusses his policies that he literally wants to abolish the income tax. And they don't no one really scrutinizes and follows up with a question. Okay, so how are we going to pay for the infrastructure of the United States? We got a $900 billion defense budget. How are we going to pay for that? So the lack of journalism, I think, is part of this as well.
Well, but that's the what. So that's the phenomenon we're talking about. It's not that he went on Joe Rogan. It's that he completely can avoid scrutiny, people asking him tough questions about those things.
Correct.
But what I'm saying is that it's bigger than that because what I think is that the mainstream media essentially has been beaten down by Donald Trump. He has basically gotten them to the point where because they tried to raise alarms about Access Hollywood. They tried to raise alarms about all these things for all this time. And the response they got wasn't necessarily one, like they got a passionate response from some people. And then kind of the rest of the response wasn't what they were looking for, particularly if they're trying to make money. They remember the mainstream media. And again, why it's silly to call it a left-wing media or liberal media, because they're a money-driven enterprise. They are out there trying to get dollars. And so when you're talking about CNN or whoever, it's like they're trying to get viewers. So they're doing things that they think are going to create engagement. And I think what they have determined is that trying to call Donald Trump on the deficiencies or, hey, you're not explaining this or anything like that doesn't drive engagement. And so I think that they just don't do that anymore because they don't see it as a strategy to maximize their political or their political viewership. And whereas, again, this goes back to the standards you hold yourself to. Kamala Harris does hold herself to a high standard. And so she does not shy away from or attack the media for asking her tough questions. Whereas Donald Trump, if you ask him tough questions, he starts attacking the media, which then that drives engagement for him. He says, CBS wants to ask me tough questions. Okay, I'm going to take away CBS's broadcasting license
it's not even when I get into office. He avoided the interview. He was too scared to go on. And for that, he wants to take their license. They didn't even get to ask him.
But what I'm saying is that I think that as long as the partisans, the supporters of Trump accept that, they as long as they've lowered their standards, I don't think he has any standards. So they've gotten rid of any standards that they may have had as it relates to him in terms of the kind of person they could support. As long as that happens, then I think the signal that the mainstream media, like the big media, and again, CNN, New York Times, all those, Washington Post, which again, we've seen some interesting things on that about as far as how they approach politics now. But I think that they just don't see being trying to hold the candle, hold a fire to Donald Trump's feet as being something that makes money. And so therefore they don't do it because, journalism right now, and this is an issue, in terms of the larger entities, because it's such a profit driven thing. And again, it wasn't always like this. Like if you go back 40 years and before, large news organizations were required to have journalistic type entities, news bureaus within them they weren't required to make money. Those news bureaus, they didn't have to be profit centers. And now, just from a regulatory environment, the news bureaus have to be profit centers as well, which affects the kinds of news that we will see and the things that will be investigated and the things that won't, all to our detriment.
Yeah, no, it's true. And, that's why I just think it's a combination of everything we're talking about. And then the mindsets, like you're saying, of people themselves that receive this. And because I feel like a lot of people I know that display this type of behavior of the true double standard, because I find myself, I'm sure that someone could point out where I have double standards personally and things like that because I'm a human being. But I tend to think that even if it's a politician I like, if they started behaving a certain way, I would call them out mentally on it.
There would be a certain point that you would,
I can't support this person.
You'd be like, hey, up, I can't, exactly.
And it's again like. And I don't understand this mindset because I'm thinking like, okay, and you're right about like the journalism. I'm thinking about the recent uproar in the Washington Post because apparently the whole staff wanted to endorse Kamala Harris and Jeff Bezos goes and puts a squash on it. Now, that reminds me of the other...
And he does that like right before or right after, right? Like within the same day or two of him meeting with Donald Trump about his space company.
And that's kind of my point.
Which gets into an oligarchy problem, by the way. But we won't.
That's my point in saying this, that we got that happening, which clearly is him putting his thumb on the scale of the journalistic integrity of one of his properties, which is a newspaper and a media company, to make sure that his other entity, which is the space thing and Amazon's defense contracts and all that, doesn't get hurt. So it got me thinking about, okay, he's like the second richest guy in the world. And then the richest guy in the world owns one of the largest media companies called X, formerly Twitter, who he's openly got his thumb on the scale for Donald Trump. So we've got the richest guy in the world openly pouring money into a presidential candidate, the second richest guy in the world being kind of kowtowed into, hanging back from making a public opinion about the election. And it's like, again, the double standard. And then I still got to hear from people in my life somehow about that George Soros is funding Kamala Harris. And I'm thinking, we got, this guy, Timothy Mellon, is giving $165 million. You got the Adelson lady. Like, all these billionaires lining up to just feed Donald Trump money. And Kamala Harris has raised $1 billion, mostly off small donors. But again, still the perception is that somehow it's not the Republican Party that's captured by elite billionaires. Like, you know what I mean? And then when you have things like, the Supreme Court and all the, it's just, anyway, man, I need to stop. I need to go get a cup of coffee.
A cup of decaf, man. But
maybe a shot of whiskey. How about that?
Yeah, there you go. That's even better. So no, I mean, and I do want to wrap this up from here, but I think that I agree with you though that the double standard this isn't something that's new in our political discourse. Like you talked about, even with the during Clinton's impeachment for the extramarital stuff that was going on during his White House term. The guy leading it, Newt Gingrich, was having an affair at that moment with one of his staff members. And like, it really does come down to though, both for the individuals and the groups, the standards they choose to hold themselves to. And I think that that's really, us as Americans can try to hold each other to a higher standard, but that it can't be something that we don't, like, people have to voluntarily do it. We have to try to inspire people to hold themselves to a higher standard. We can't force people to hold themselves to a higher standard, and so just like we try to, we all work to have allegiance to the Constitution, talk like talking about, paraphrasing, General Milley. Like it's the Constitution. It's not loyalty to the country or to the leader or anything like that. It's to the Constitution, and we should encourage each other and we should try to inspire each other to all have that loyalty to the Constitution. But we can't really force it. And so if a person starts saying, "Hey, yeah, like Constitution's in my way," or "I need to get rid of the Constitution," like Donald Trump does, if other Americans are willing to go along with that, then we can't turn around and force them necessarily to say, hey, maybe we should stick to the Constitution like we said we were doing here and not follow this demagogue into wherever they want to go. So I think that the voluntary aspect of it is what we're really seeing, and that if one person or if one group have decided that they're not going to hold themselves to a higher standard anymore, it causes imbalances, and we see those, and we got to live with those imbalances. We can complain about them, we can push back against them, but ultimately we would just need some reason, or they need some reason, to come back into the fold and start doing the America that's based on the U.S. Constitution again, which admittedly the U.S. Constitution is a high standard. It is meant to hold you to a high standard. You're in power, you want to shut somebody up, well, you know what, there's freedom of speech. You can't really do that, and so that's that's the kinds of things that are higher standard. That's what those are. Can't unreasonably search and seize people. Like the government can't come and take away all your guns, which is one that I know some people, that's the only one they really care about. But nonetheless, it's a whole package. So I do think we can wrap from there. But again, it's really about the standard that people hold themselves to, I think, more than anything. And yes, there's a double standard, but that double standard is because the Trump side has decided they're not going to hold themselves to a higher standard anymore. And while the Harris side is still holding themselves to that standard, that traditional American standard of, hey, what's your policy, or what are you going to do? Hey, release your tax return, or all these things that just are traditional American standards.
Yeah, well, I think, look, it can't be escaped. You made a brief comment. I know we're wrapping up, but also about the fact that she's a female, fact that she's a Black woman. I think that comes into it as well, just in the American story, because again, we just had a recent Madison Square Garden rally where there were some really racist things said, and I watched J.D. Vance, as a vice presidential candidate, follow up on that the next day and say, with a group of Americans behind him clapping when he says this, we need to get off all this stuff and stop being so sensitive about what everybody says, this and that, and the crowd's cheering behind him. And you know what I'm thinking of? I'm thinking these are the same people that literally stopped our country, the whole cultural conversation, because an NFL player took a knee during the anthem in 2017. And it's always like, that's what I feel like. This group of Americans is always gaslighting the rest of us, because they're the ones going nuts about when a transgender person was on the Bud Light beer can, or about anything that they don't agree with in the culture.
Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, Dr. Seuss and all that. So they have a hissy fit and start crying. And then when actually there's a guy who's introducing the former president of the United States who's running again to be president, and the guy is literally saying that Latinos are like having babies like rabbits, and they say, come inside me, like they come inside the country. That there's not an issue with that, like that's appropriate.
We should just look the other way then.
Yeah, we shouldn't say anything for the guy introducing the guy about to lead the country, and he's totally disparaging many groups of Americans. I think there's something to be said for that. Yeah, there's a double standard.
The evidence of the double standards we're confronted with that every day. But the source, like I said, is really, it's coming from the inside. It's about the standards people are holding themselves to. I mean, and that's something that. Yeah. Hopefully we can reach, our fellow Americans at some point, and they can, stop or start holding themselves to a higher standard than the one that they're doing now. Because we kind of, again, we're all in this together. So we kind of need most of us pulling in the same direction and trying to live up to a higher standard. So but I think we can wrap this topic from there. We appreciate everyone for joining us on this episode. Join us on the second part as well. And we'll talk to you then.